Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, we're starting a new series, and it's one that was suggested to us, actually by many different listeners. After we finished the series on the great political fictions, a lot of people said, why not do the great political films? And so that is what we're going to do. And I have to say, I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to be talking about a lot of great films from the best part of the last 100 years. And we're starting in 1937 with La Grande Illusion. Jean Renoir's La Grande Illusion, which just may be the greatest of all political films, is also a film with a very clear, straightforward, hard-to-miss political lesson. Renoir was a pacifist and a humanist. He was also, incidentally, the son of the French Impressionist painter Renoir. Pierre-Auguste Renoir was his father, so he grew up in a kind of artistic privilege. His father wanted him to be a ceramicist, but he became a filmmaker instead, so his brother Claude became the ceramicist. He made La Grande Illusion towards the end of the 1930s, at a time when Europe seemed back on, if not an inevitable, then certainly an ominous path towards war and conflict and violence and conquest and killing. All the things that were anathema to a humanist and a pacifist like Jean Renoir. He set La Grande Illusion in the last great European conflagration, what was still then known as the Great War, because there hadn't been a Second World War yet, but people sensed maybe it was coming. And in La Grande Illusion, set during the First World War, Renoir depicts a set of human relationships, essentially three human relationships, each of which is a pair, which cross or transcend enemy lines, the political and military divisions of the age. They cut across the things that in war separate human beings from each other. So one of these relationships is between an aristocratic French officer and an aristocratic German officer who happens in the film to become the commandant of the prison camp where the French officer is held. And these two men, though they are on opposite sides, forge a bond. There is a friendship between them, and there is certainly a deep connection between them. The second relationship is between another French officer, this one not an aristocrat at all, but a working class or lower middle class man called Maréchal, Lieutenant Maréchal, who is a flight engineer, an engineer in the French Air Force. And he forms a loving relationship. He falls in love with a German woman. She's a war widow, and when he escapes from that same prison camp, she takes him in, and they fall in love. The third relationship is also involving Maréchal, and this time it is with a Frenchman, another French officer, Lieutenant Rosenthal, Maréchal and Rosenthal. What divides them is that Rosenthal is not only rich, it's clear in the film that he's very rich, he's a Jew. The Frenchman, and though he's also a Frenchman, the Jew. And in each case, a bond is forged. There is a real human relationship between these individuals, despite the fact that the spirit of the age is meant to push them apart. And the message is that what unites us is more than what divides us. And what unites us is our common humanity. So far, so uplifting. But if that's what this film was about, if that was the message that it hammered at its audience, it would not be a great film. It would be a bit of a bore. I don't want to sit through 2 hours of cinema and have someone force down my throat the idea that what unites us is our common humanity. What makes this a great film is that it is not uplifting. Despite the fact that that is the message, it is not uplifting. It is deeply melancholy. It is an incredibly sad film in its way. And all of these relationships are shot through with regret. All of the participants in these relationships have a deep sense of regret, of a kind of sadness. There is irony throughout this film. Ironies abound in all of these relationships. And the human beings who bond in this way also, all of them have a sense of the absurdity of their situation. This is a melancholy, ironic, and in its way, absurd story. And that's what makes it so wonderful. The irony, indeed the absurdity, is captured in part by the title of the film, La Grande Illusion, the Great Illusion. What is the illusion? What is the illusion that's being referred to here? So on one level, the illusion is the war itself, the First World War, the Great War, which is an absurdity. Why are these people trying to kill each other, given that they are capable of loving each other, of befriending and loving each other? What is it that drives human beings to murder each other for no reason? And the war is presented as something which is in its way absurd. It is an absurd conflict in which the violence, the horror, has no real explanation or justification, certainly not one that makes any kind of deep sense to the participants. They all feel it. They all have a feeling of what this is about, but it also disappears in a kind of cloud of smoke when they encounter people from the other side. So the war is the absurdity. The war is the illusion. But the absurdity is also the reality in this film. The thing that is absurd is the world that these people are living in, and it is very hard to escape. The irony, indeed the regret that runs through this film, is the fact that despite the capacity of human beings to forge these kinds of relationships, it's almost impossible to escape from the forces that pull these relationships apart. So even if the war is absurd, it is also the reality. The reality is absurd. So what is the illusion here? The war is the illusion, but also the idea that it's possible to escape from this kind of conflict is also a kind of illusion. The title is borrowed from a book. So it comes from a book that was first published in 1909, though it was reprinted in 1933 and it acquired another vogue again a few years before La Grande Illusion came out. It's a book by a British journalist and eventually politician called Norman Angell, and its name was The Great Illusion. That's where this title comes from, just translated into French. And it was for a while, celebrated book, and then it became a notorious book. In 1909, when it was published, it made the case that war, the kinds of wars that were being talked up by the military and political elites of Europe, the people in charge of Britain and France and Germany and Austro-Hungary and Russia and Italy and everywhere, that kind of atmosphere of militarized, inevitable conflict was absurd. And the reasons, the justifications that were given by these political and military elites for not just contemplating the possibility of a European war, but sometimes at least celebrating that idea, were also absurd. Angell argued that the argument for war collapses as soon as you put any pressure on it. The idea that war is a way to assert your nation in the world, to bring out the best in your people, to celebrate their spirit of endeavor and their spirit of martial valor is ridiculous. War is violence, war is horror, but also war is destruction. War is not a way to protect your people. Certainly it's not a way to enrich your people. It's not a way to acquire territory which will make your people better off. War destroys economic value. War destroys prosperity. And as Angell said, by 1909, so by the start of the 20th century, in Europe at least, what united the people of the different countries was far greater than what divided them, because what united them was the fact that their common economic prosperity depended on each other. They were united by shared markets and shared rules and shared international organizations. And anything that would tear those ties apart was destructive. So any justification for war that claimed through war not all of these peoples or nations of Europe, but at least the victors would be better off, was ridiculous. And in this book, he goes through the reasons why it's ridiculous. In 1909, the book was fashionable and it was taken up by many people, including many politicians who wanted to push back against the possibility of a European war. But in 1914, the book itself was seen by many people as having been shown to be ridiculous. The book that called war, seemingly the illusion, was itself shown to have been a kind of illusion because the war came anyway. But that was a very unfair judgment on Angell and his book. It's one of those books that acquired an unjustified reputation as a sort of false prophecy. It's cited, I think it's cited in J.B. Priestley's And Inspector Calls as an example of the kind of things that people believed before the First World War exposed many of those beliefs as being hollow follies. It's listed along with the idea that the Titanic was unsinkable. But Angel's book, The Great Illusion, doesn't say that war is impossible or that it's not going to happen. It's not a prophecy. Or insofar as it is a prophecy, what it says is that if war does come, it will be a kind of illusion. It would be fought on false pretenses. It would be fought in a kind of trance. It would be fought by people who have believed things which are hazy and unjustifiable fantasies of how the world is. But it doesn't say that it's impossible that people should be in the grip of such fantasies. It just says, if the war comes, those are the circumstances under which it must inevitably arise. It will not come about because people have thought through the consequences of what they are doing and calculated the best outcomes for the peoples that they represent. And you could say that far from being a false prophecy, that was actually a pretty accurate account of the circumstances under which war would be fought. In my conversations with Chris Clark, in which we talked about the what-ifs of the assassination in Sarajevo, but the circumstances under which the elites of Europe stumbled, or as Chris Clark puts it, sleptwalked their way into war, it does feel like it happened in a kind of trance. It does feel like these people were in the grip of forces and beliefs and ideas about themselves and who they are, which were, if not fantastical, at least in part illusory. That's how the war came about. It's a bit like another book that has a reputation as a false prophecy that wasn't a prophecy at all, Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, which people now say was a ridiculous book, an absurd book, because it said history had come to an end with the end of the Cold War and history hasn't ended, and everything that's happened since shows that Fukuyama got it wrong. But like Angel, Fukuyama wasn't saying, this is the way it's going to go. Fukuyama was saying, if it is the case that the great ideological struggles of the 20th century are now over, the future will be conducted under conditions in which many of the things that we believe will be hollow. And that might be a bad thing. Apart from anything else, The End of History is also a very melancholy book. In fact, its title is The End of History and the Last Man. But people remember these books as having said the world is going this way, and then when it goes the other way, they say, aha, you're wrong. Angel wasn't wrong. What he was saying was, if this thing comes, it will be experienced more or less as a kind of bad dream. And the film actually really captures that. Angel's book, when it was published in 1909, actually had a different title. So the publishers changed the title quickly, and it was the new title that took off. It was a better title, The Great Illusion. But the original title of the book was Europe's Optical Illusion. That was what the first edition was called. And though it's not such a good title, it's clunky, it actually captures something of what the book is saying, because the thing about an optical illusion, I think we all know this, is that if you look at an optical illusion and your brain tells itself that the lines are of a very different length, or that the picture is moving and the circles are swirling, or whatever it is, everyone knows that experience. And then it is explained to the other part of the brain, not a straightforwardly visual part, that this is not what's going on. And you can see in a different way that actually, if you look at it at a different angle, the picture isn't moving or the lines are the same. And you get to understand what's going on. You get to understand the ways in which you've been deceived. But then if you look at the picture again, you still see it the way you originally saw it. Being told this is an optical illusion does not usually persuade your brain that the lines actually are the same length. And you're caught in this weird, this is the fun of optical illusions. It's kind of creepy. You're caught in this weird situation in which you simultaneously know that the thing you're looking at is one thing, and you also see it, really see it, convincingly see it as something else. That is what La Grande Illusion depicts. The characters in La Grande Illusion can see the situations that they're in their absurdity, and they also simultaneously see them in the way that the war has conditioned them to see them. And they can't just see it one way. That's the sadness. In some cases, that's the tragedy. In the film, The word illusion comes up quite a few times. The characters talk about this or that being an illusion. At the end, we're given more or less the great illusion. Rosenthal, the Jewish French officer, is talking to Maréchal, the working class French officer, and they've escaped. They're on their way to Switzerland. And there's a discussion about what they're going to do if they get away. And Maréchal says, well, I'm going to join up again. Having escaped German captivity, I'm going to go back to my regiment and resume the fight because we've got to bring this war to an end. I can't sort of sit this war out. We've got to bring this war to an end. He doesn't even say we have to win it. He just says we have to end it so that there will be no more war. This is the war that's meant to end war. So I've got to fight. I can't sit this one out. And Rosenthal says that's the great illusion. That's your illusion, that there is a war that might end war. But there are other points in the film where characters say to other characters, this is the illusion. The first part of the film is set in a prison camp, but not the one from which Maréchal and Rosenthal escape. First of all, they're in a different camp, these French officers, and a lot of it is comic. It's a benign environment. We don't see any actual conflict in this film. This is not a First World War film set in the trenches. This is not about the horror of war, not at all. The horror is just there in the background. It is unspoken and unsaid, though it's real. It's set in a prison camp in which there is a lot of dressing up. So in this film, there's a lot of dressing up. The officers are wearing different uniforms. Some of the officers, the aristocratic ones, are particularly conscious of always looking the part. But also in the first prison camp, the officers get sent a consignment of women's clothes so that they can put on a show. It's a familiar theme of men in prisoner of war camps. One of the things they do to pass the time is they dress up as women and put on a kind of cabaret. And that's what these French officers do. And it is presented as ridiculous, but also sort of vaguely endearing, depending on your perspective. But there's a moment in this, these unwashed, unshaven French prisoners of war have this cache of women's clothes. But one of them, one of the younger ones, not particularly feminine or even good looking, but just younger and more fresh-faced, puts on a dress and sort of walks through the room in which all these clothes are laid out in front of all the other officers dressed as a woman. And suddenly silence falls on all of them. And they go into a kind of stupor as though a woman has suddenly walked among them. Now, no one looks at this and thinks this guy is a woman. He looks like a soldier in a dress. And yet they all willingly suspend their disbelief. It's not sexual, but it's kind of romantic. There's a sort of sigh of longing that goes out among these people. They know it's an illusion. Indeed, one of the characters talks about all of this as the great illusion. These people are dressing up. And yet it's the thing that they cling on to. It's one of the most intense moments of emotion in the film, collective emotion. This camp is set next to a German army training camp. So the prisoners are on one side of the line and they can look out of the window and they can see German soldiers training for the war, young men training for the war, also dressing up. Being a soldier is dressing up. This was one of the themes of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, written at the end of the 18th century. One of her great lines in that book is that, and the late 18th century was another age of European martial ethos, a time in which the idea of the soldier, the heroic soldier, the national hero, was dominant in the political imagination. This was about to be the age of Napoleon. And she says, these soldiers present themselves to the world as men, but they're incredibly feminine because they are obsessed with clothes and with dressing up. What is soldiering but dressing up? And these prisoners look out at these young German men and effectively they say, we're soldiers pretending to be women and these are boys pretending to be soldiers. It's all illusory. It's all a kind of show. The two aristocratic officers, Captain Bouldieu, the French, and von Rauffenstein, the German aristocrat, de von, they spend a lot of time dressing up. von Rauffenstein, when we see him later on in the film, when he's become the commandant of the prisoner of war camp, he's been badly burned. He's been invalided out of the Air Force, and so he's reduced to running a prison camp, which makes him miserable. He wants to be back fighting. But he wears a uniform which is ridiculous, including the fact that it goes right up and covers his neck and his chin. He's trussed up in this shiny, polished, ridiculous outfit. Bourdieu spends a lot of time fussing about his clothes. He always wants to look elegant. He spends a ridiculous amount of time adjusting the way he stands, the way he looks. He preens himself. He's an absurd figure in many ways. There is a fantastic scene in this film. It's worth the price of admission on its own, in which Bourdieu is talking to his fellow French prisoners, the officers, about their escape plan from the second camp they wind up in. It's actually the last camp. They're transferred through a series of camps. And the last one is a kind of fortress camp. It's a castle. It's much harder to escape from. They come up with a plan for escape. It involves Bourdieu actually more or less sacrificing himself. He will not escape. He will create a distraction. And he insists that for this act, he has to wear white gloves. And we see him discussing the escape and at the same time washing his white gloves. And he washes them by putting them on his hands and then dipping them in water and then rubbing them and stroking them and squeezing them all the time that he's talking about their plan. It's ridiculous. It's also weirdly touching. And what he seems to be trying to do is to sort of make the gloves his skin. So you see his hands molding themselves more and more into these gloves, pushing on them and pressing on them and stroking them and straightening them. So that in the end, I don't know what they're made of, calfskin or something, they're soft and they're elegant. And he wants his hands to become the begloved hands. He suspects, rightly, that this escapade that they're engaged on may cost him his life. And you feel like he feels, when the moment comes, he wants to be wearing well-fitting white calfskin gloves. That's who he is. There's another great moment in the film, another moment of illusion and the exposing of illusion, and then the recreation of the illusion that's been exposed, which is the theme of this film. The French officers in the first prison camp want to put on a show, a kind of cabaret using these outfits, these costumes, cheer themselves up. But just before the show is about to be performed to their fellow prisoners, they hear the bad news that's relayed to them by the Germans in order to let them know that Germany is winning the war. This is early 1916, so this is, we now know, in the middle of the war. They have no idea where it is in the war. That a fort called Douaumont, which is near Verdun, has fallen to the Germans. And this is a great symbolic defeat for the French army. This fort has been taken and the Germans are exultant and the French officers are despondent. Feels like this is a really bad news moment in the war. But they decide to go ahead with the show, and they think, what they'll do to sort of show the kind of people they are is they'll invite the German officers to come and watch this show, watch them dress up as women and do the can-can and sing cabaret songs to show that their spirit is unbroken, I guess. And the Germans come and watch it, and the Germans, being German, don't really know what to make of all this. They like a different kind of dressing up. Or if they're going to dress up like that, I think they do it in private. And then just before the show, or actually I think it's during the show, the news comes through that the fort has been retaken. The French have retaken Douaumont, and the great triumph of the German army. And with hindsight, Renoir knows, his audience know, everyone knows that all of this is kind of meaningless in the great sweep of the war. But at the time, these were vast lurches of fortune and emotion. The Germans have been rebuffed and their celebration was premature. And so the performance is stopped, even though they're all still, many of them, dressed up. And instead they sing La Marseillaise in the face of the German officers. They belt out La Marseillaise to show that actually the really important way they're going to demonstrate their spirit is to remind the Germans that they're winning the war. It's a scene that is then recreated in a different form in another film, not many years later, in Casablanca, in Rick's Café Américain, where a group of German officers are singing a German song, and the cafe, with Rick's blessing, sings La Marseillaise as a kind of rebuff. And all of the people in the cafe, and by no means all of them are French, sing La Marseillaise to stick it to the Germans. In Casablanca, it's a euphoric moment. In La Grande Illusion, it's sad. Even as they're singing it, it feels like a kind of absurd defiance. Some of them, after all, are dressed in women's clothes. But also, we discover it is absurd because the fort is retaken by the Germans again just a few days or weeks later. You know, the defiance evaporates like mist. It meant nothing. It is definitely the sad, ironic, regretful, absurd version of singing the Marseillaise in the face of German officers. One of the themes of Norman Angel's book, one of the ways in which he cashes out the idea of the Great Illusion, was to argue that Europe before the war, he didn't know the war was coming, but Europe 1909, 1910, in the age of the optical illusion, was in the grip of a set of ideas that were being clung onto by a military and political elite that knew its time had probably come. So this was this militaristic, martial spirit of the age, the appetite for war and for sacrifice, but also for glory, all of that dulce et decorum est rubbish. This was the ethos of a class, an aristocratic class primarily, who knew its time was probably up and was clinging on to these beliefs as part of the wreckage that it was trying to preserve. So that Europe was in the grip of an illusory idea of conflict and politics and war, from which it couldn't escape because it was in the grip of a class that was on the way out but couldn't finally give up. And that is certainly part of the theme of La Grande Illusion, in that relationship between the two aristocratic officers, the French and the German aristocrat, Boieldieu and von Rauffenstein. They meet, first of all, because von Rauffenstein shoots down Boieldieu's plane and he's captured, and von Rauffenstein greets him at the start of the film in the German flying officers' mess, which is, viewers will notice straight away when they see the film, the same as the French flying officers' mess that we've seen at the start of the film, just with different posters and different propaganda up. These are the same people, and von Rauffenstein is an incredibly polite and hospitable captor, and he treats his captives with incredible courtesy. He gets up, he pulls out chairs for them, he serves them his best food, his best wine, because he recognizes in Boieldieu, but not in Maréchal, a fellow member of his class, a man who believes in the same things, the same ethos, the same ideas, the same ideals. And when they encounter each other again, when Boieldieu is transferred to the camp that von Rauffenstein is now the commandant of, they rekindle this relationship and they deepen it. They have conversations in which they talk about their shared life before the war. They recognize the complete absurdity of a situation in which they are expected to try to kill each other because they have so much in common. And as von Rauffenstein in particular wants to point out, they have much more in common with each other than they do with their fellow officers, and certainly with their fellow soldiers. They have a class bond, the bond of this dying breed of European aristocrats. It is absurd that they should be trying to kill each other. And the absurdity is brought out. At one point, they recognize, to their mild amusement, that they used to frequent the same Parisian nightclub, and then they discover that actually they both had a thing with the same woman, and she is absurdly called Fifi. So these two ex-boyfriends of Fifi still, because of the ethos of their class and the moral code by which they live, can both recognize their shared bond and also recognize that they need to try to kill each other. And in the ultimate absurdity, past the point where they have bonded in this way, one of them does indeed kill the other one. So von Rauffenstein kills Boieldieu. And he does it because Boieldieu, in the spirit of his class, in the ethos of the code that he thinks he is required to uphold, when his group of officers decide to make a kind of quixotic escape from this impregnable castle fortress, he realizes there isn't capacity for all of them to get away, so he agrees to be the diversion so that Maréchal and Rosenthal can lower themselves on a rope and get away. That's why he wears the white gloves. He does indeed create a diversion. He parades around on the parapets of this castle. It's another show. He's dressed up. He might as well be in women's clothing. And von Rauffenstein realizes to his regret that he's going to have to shoot him. Von Rauffenstein tries to shoot him in the leg because he doesn't want to kill him. And again, absurdly, he misses and he shoots him in the stomach. And the hope was he could shoot him in the leg, give him a nice, noble war wound, and they could carry on their friendship and drinking wine and chatting about the old days and Fifi. He shoots him in the stomach, which, as we are shown as Bourdieu lies on his deathbed with von Rauffenstein sitting there, and it's like a love scene. And von Rauffenstein is mortified that he shot this man. And if you shoot someone in the stomach, it is a terribly painful way to die. There is nothing glamorous about this death. It is awful, and it is painful, and it is miserable. And von Rauffenstein can only apologize, as men of his class do, and say, old chap, I'm terribly sorry that you are now dying an unspeakable death at my hand. I wish it was otherwise. And Bourdieu, being the kind of man he is, says, don't worry, old chap, it's fine. And anyway, actually, as we know for our class, this is a good way to die. He says, for the ordinary soldier, war is a tragedy and a death in war is grotesque. But for us, actually, it's glorious. This is the best way for people of our class to die. It's sort of what we're born for and what we're bred for. So don't apologize, old bean. He obviously doesn't say old bean. So don't apologize. Really, it's fine. It is ridiculous. He is dying the most agonizing death. And it's a kind of self-willed death. Indeed, it's a kind of suicide. And in some ways, it symbolizes the suicide of the class to which he and von Rauffenstein belong, because the Great War was the suicide of that class. Marxists have always grappled with the great puzzle of the First World War, which is, why did the workers of Europe agree to kill each other on that scale? Why did they forge a bond with their oppressors, the capitalists, the elites, the rulers of their nations, and do their bidding to kill each other when, of course, as any Marxist knows, the workers have more in common, they have more that unites them, than any bond they have with their capitalist oppressors inside their own nation states. And yet somehow the true bond, the bond across class, broke down, and the false bond, the bond between the worker and the oppressive ruling class, held in each of these nations. So that's the great puzzle of the First World War, the great tragedy of the First World War. And it has to be explained in Marxist terms as a kind of trick, a con. The workers were deceived. They were the victims of the false consciousness that had been instilled in them by capitalism and indeed by imperialist capitalism. But the other question is, and it's also a question that Marxists are interested in, why did the ruling class fight each other, given what they had in common? And Marxists have an answer to that, which is the ruling class are the self-deceived. The workers are the deceived, but the ruling class are the self-deceived. And they cannot tell themselves the truth, which is actually they are at each other's throats because they are all cutthroat capitalists. This film is not a Marxist film. It's not interested in those kind of explanations. But what it is interested in is the sense that the people who are responsible for this war also, in a sense, committed suicide through it. Their class was washed away as it was, not just or not even primarily actually in France and Germany, but the Russian aristocratic elites were destroyed by this war because it gave birth to the Russian Revolution. The Austro-Hungarian elites were wiped away. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was wiped away by this war. The people who went to war in the grip of their delusion, the sleepwalkers, destroyed themselves. And Bourdieu recognizes this. He says, we're on the way out. So if we're on the way out, we might as well go out like this, not in glory, but at least in his own mind, at least, with a kind of dignity befitting the class to which he belongs. It's actually, again, absurdly, ironically, grotesquely, an incredibly undignified death that he has, even though von Rauffenstein puts him in a comfortable bed and has a nurse to tend to him. The man is dying of a shot to the stomach, but even in his death agony, he maintains his dignity. That's their bond, and yet there is a difference between them. There's a difference between Bourdieu and von Rauffenstein. Von Rauffenstein invites Bourdieu to drink wine with him and to talk to him, though one is the man running the camp and one is a prisoner. And Bourdieu says to him, why have you sought me out? And von Rauffenstein says, well, of course, because we have more in common with each other than either of us do with our fellow officers. And Bourdieu says, but, you're not talking to Maréchal, the working class officer, or to Rosenthal, the wealthy Jewish officer. And von Rauffenstein says, yes, because I don't have anything really in common with them, and nor actually do you. I mean, you're all French, but come on, the bond between us is far stronger than the bond between you and them. And Bourdieu won't have it. Bourdieu says, these are good people. These are my people. And I won't accept that somehow you and I, de Bourdieu, von Rauffenstein, have more in common than I do with Rosenthal. And the German says that's because of your stupid French Revolution. You've kind of been conditioned. You know, you're an aristocrat like me, but you're an aristocrat in a nation that went through something which means you can't fully own up to what you must truly believe, which is that we are a class apart. That's where they differ. And Bourdieu doesn't accept it. I mean, he accepts the French Revolution has made them different. He doesn't accept that that's his false consciousness. Von Rauffenstein is in many ways the more sympathetic character. Bourdieu is really arrogant. He is ridiculous with his white gloves. Von Rauffenstein has been horribly wounded, so his outfit is a reflection of actually his vulnerability. There's an outer shell and an inner vulnerability. And he's clearly, in his way, a decent man. And he's a little agonized by the situation he finds himself in. But he's also a little bit more bitter than Bourdieu. Bourdieu is resigned. He's fatalistic. This is a glorious exit. Von Rauffenstein is still fighting the fight. He's still trying to hold on to something that he thinks is not lost, which is whatever it is that he thinks that they represent, the order that they represent. And so there is the seed of the ultimate divergence of these two men. One is fatalistic and resigned, but the other one has a germ of resentment in him. And this is 1916 when we see them. The war is not over. It's not clear who's going to win, who's going to lose. At this point, the Frenchman is the captive of the German. But the German is ultimately going to lose. And in that defeat, you get a glimpse in this film of what may be going to happen, because von Rauffenstein might think he's defending an order which is probably on the way out, but he refuses to accept it's on the way out. It is on the way out. And after the First World War in Germany, that order, that decency, as he sees it, that kind of aristocratic ethos will be swept away by fascism. And some of the von Rauffensteins will resist fascism. There were aristocratic resistors, but not many, and certainly not many in the German army. Most of the von Rauffensteins signed up. Most of them pledged their allegiance to Hitler, to the Führer. Who knows what von Rauffenstein would have done? The character in this film is probably too old to face that choice. We don't know what his fate is after the First World War, but there is at least the hint here that the germ of resentment, the fact he is fighting against something that is inevitable, means that when defeat comes, the resentment could flare up in another way. And actually, the bond between these two men, the friendship that von Rauffenstein in particular insists on, is itself the illusion. One of the other absurdities in their relationship is that they have a common language, and the common language is English. So some of the time they speak in German and some of the time in French. But there are moments when they don't want their fellow officers to overhear what they're saying, presumably because they're being a bit too chummy. They speak to each other in English. English is their common language, even though the English are the allies of one and the enemies of the other. But that also, by the standards of this class, is part of the absurdity. The English are fighting with the French, but the English are the traditional enemies of the French. The English have at various points been the allies of the Germans, but now they're their mortal enemies. But English is their shared language. And it stands in contrast to another key moment in the film where English is the barrier to common understanding. So the aristocrats can all speak everyone else's language. They're a kind of cosmopolitan elite, despite the fact they are also the upholders of national difference. They're the ones that are driving this damn absurd war. But before the war, maybe the hope is after the war, that's the illusion. Their cosmopolitan shared ethos can reunite them. They speak every language, but the ordinary soldiers don't. The French speak French, the Germans speak German. About halfway through the film, the first half of it is set in a camp in which the French officers spend a lot of time digging a tunnel to try and escape. As one of them says, when you're in a prisoner of war camp and you're an officer, the game is to escape. That's what we do. Very familiar from many war films. They dig a tunnel, the familiar way out. They do it the familiar way, all the way through the history of cinema, right up to the Shawshank Redemption. They dig out the earth, they stick it in their clothes in bags, and they go and scatter it in the yard. It takes a long time. And eventually they dig all their way through and they get to the point where they think they can make their escape. They're going to come out in the orchard on the other side of the prison wall. So they decide that night they're going to escape. They're all in it together. And just before the great escape happens, a German officer comes in and says, "You're being moved to another camp because we routinely move you, presumably, so that you can't escape." And so they have a tunnel and absurdly, they can't use it. It was a waste of time. But Maréchal, the lieutenant, as they're leaving the camp, sees the new prisoners arrive, and the new prisoners are English. And in one of my favourite touches in this film, I can't explain it. I don't understand how it's meant to work. The English prisoners, the officers, come with luggage, and in their luggage they have tennis rackets. I don't know what the circumstances were in which they were meant to have been captured during the First World War with not just suitcases, but tennis rackets. I'm not sure where the tennis was being played, but they have tennis rackets. The British are ridiculous. But Marischal breaks free from his group just as they're about to be transported away, and he rushes up to one of the British officers who's dropped his suitcase and the tennis rackets and the linen shirts have spilled out. And he says to him frantically in French, "Look, we've dug a tunnel and it's there. It's ready for you to go. You can escape tonight. Like, we can't use it, but you can use it." But he can only say it in French because he can only speak French, because he's not one of the aristos. He's not one of that class. And the British officer, because the British don't speak anyone else's language, doesn't understand what he's saying and says, "I'm terribly sorry, old boy. I don't know what you're talking about. Jolly good. Bye-bye." And so the tunnel is unused. There is another relationship in which the two protagonists can't speak the same language, but they manage to overcome it. That's the second relationship which crosses enemy lines. Marischal and Rosenthal escape, in the escape in which Beaulieu is killed. They get away and they set out, which is what happens in the later parts of the film, on the long 200-mile trek to try and get across Germany to Switzerland, where they will be properly escaped. It's a very treacherous journey. They have to walk it. They have to hide during the day, go at night. Rosenthal gets injured early on. He sprains his ankle. They get slowed down. It's a miserable business. Eventually, they take refuge in what they think is a stable. They're discovered by the owner, who is a woman, a German woman. She is a widow. She takes them in. It turns out, actually, a bit like von Rauffenstein, her primary motivation is hospitality to these French men, not for class reasons, but simply, I think, because of basic human decency, but also, as we discover, because she's really lonely. Her husband is dead. Her brothers are dead. She is a woman alone with her daughter. She takes them in, and though Marischal and she's called Elsa, can't speak each other's language, he can't speak German, she can't speak French, they fall in love, and they fall in love because human beings can fall in love without speaking the same language. They fall in love merely by spending time in each other's company, by looking at each other. And it's touching, and it's also deeply sad, because Marischal will have to leave, because he can't stay there, because he is an escaped prisoner. They can't make a life together unless the war ends. Only if the war ends could this relationship work. And so he tells her that he and Rosenthal will have to leave and resume their march to Switzerland, even though clearly it breaks her heart and it breaks his heart. And it is heartbreaking. But they have no choice, because the absurdity of the war is also the reality. And it's not clear there is a situation in which this relationship is going to work. Marischal says he will come back. When the war is over, he will come back. And then on the march, he says to Rosenthal, "I have to rejoin my regiment and I have to end this damn war by implication so that I can go back to Elsa. I can't be with Elsa while this war continues. What is there that I can do to end it? Well, I have to fight in it. The only way to end the war is to fight in the war," which is the absurdity. But how is this war going to end? And if it ends in the defeat of Germany, is there going to be a way that these two can resume their relationship? This is 1916. When Elsa takes them in, she has food to feed them with. They are basically starving, and she saves their lives by feeding them, because she has more than enough food. But by 1918, she wouldn't. By 1918, Germany was starving. Germany was being starved out of the war. Will Marischal survive? I mean, as a way of getting back to Elsa, rejoining, going back to the front. He's a flight engineer, so he's not in the trenches, but nonetheless, going back to the fight. There's no reason to think that he's going to be one of the lucky ones. There's nothing about their farewell that makes you believe that this story is going to have a happy ending. They have no common language, but they find the common language of love. But the common language of love is not enough to hold them together, because the languages that divide their peoples, their respective peoples, are still the dominant ones. And then there's the relationship between Marischal and Rosenthal. Rosenthal, the wealthy Jew, appears throughout the film in different guises. Early on, he's the outsider in the group. There's clearly some suspicion of him. The anti-Semitism in this film, I mean, the film itself is not remotely anti-Semitic, but the implicit anti-Semitism of some of the characters is fairly deeply buried, except probably in the case of von Rauffenstein, who really doesn't think that Bourdieu should be friendly with a fellow officer like Rosenthal. Rosenthal, as a wealthy member of a wealthy Jewish family, has access to goodies. He gets stuff sent to him in the camp that he shares with his fellow officers. And in a way, he buys their friendship. They come to, if not like him, at least to tolerate him because he has the best food sent from home. He also gives a speech at one point, which again is profoundly ironic, both in the context of the film, but also in the light of what was to happen to the Jews of France, to the Jews of Europe. As they're talking about what this war is for, what are they fighting for? What is Bourdieu fighting for? He's fighting for an ethos which probably only he understands and is a kind of performance. It's a sort of act of dignity, and it will cost him his life. Rosenthal says, of all of you, I'm the one who's got the most to fight for here. Like, we're the Rosenthals, right? We've bought the chateaus. He more or less says to Bourdieu, you're the aristos on the way out. You haven't got the money anymore. We've got it. We made our money in trade, in business. And I have the thing that really needs defending here. I have wealth. I have property. France, he doesn't quite say it, but bits of France anyway, belong to me. So I damn well want to win this war. I have the strongest reason to fight. But the others aren't buying it, partly because they think he's a parvenu. This is a sort of false acquisition of France. But also because, as they're aware, as he's probably aware, that bond is very fragile. He doesn't actually have a bit of France. That bond is easily broken. Here is a man who is fighting for his country in the First World War by 1937, certainly by 1939, definitely by 1940 and Vichy France. For a French Jew to say, I'm a patriot, I fought in the First World War, I defended this country, is not going to save him. It's not going to save Rosenthal. We don't know what happens to any of these characters after 1916. And in 1937, when Renoir made this film, no one knew what was to come, but we can guess. Maréchal and Rosenthal don't like each other. There is a real animosity between them. Maréchal is a robust, healthy, working Frenchman. Rosenthal is a little effete. He's a little weak, and he's the one who sprains his ankle when they're on the march. He's the one who's limping along. He's the one who finds the march physically really demanding. And Maréchal gets more and more annoyed. This man is holding them back. They've got to get to Switzerland, and he's too much of a wimp. And they have a massive falling out where Maréchal basically abandons him and says, I'm done with looking after you, you whining, filthy Jew. And it all comes out, all the prejudice comes out, all of the conventional phrases of the age come out. I've had enough of you, and I'm done with you, and this, whatever bond we had between us is broken. Like, we just were thrown together because we escaped together. We have nothing in common. You're on your own. And he marches off, and then he comes back because he can't leave him, because actually the bond is far stronger than that. The bond is far greater than anything he might say in the heat of the moment. He doesn't really believe that he should leave the filthy Jew behind. He needs to rescue him, and they seek shelter, and with Elsa's help, their friendship is reformed, and they become deeply loyal to each other. And they leave again. They leave Elsa's. Maréchal is now in love. Rosenthal has seen it happen. There is a deep mutual understanding by this point. And they make it to the Swiss border. And they part ways. And the film ends with this relationship also breaking down. So the relationship between Bourdieu and von Rauffenstein, the bond between them, doesn't survive. One of them kills the other, despite what they have in common. The relationship between Maréchal and Elsa does not survive. They are in love. It's not enough. The bond is broken. The relationship between Maréchal and Rosenthal does not survive. We don't know what's going to happen, but at the end of the film, they part ways. They agree they've got a better chance of escape if they cross the border separately. They also part ways because of the conversation in which Maréchal says, I'm going to go and fight again. And Rosenthal says to him, that is the great illusion. You have fallen for the great illusion, which is that the way to end war is to prosecute more war. Who knows what would happen to that friendship after the war? But I think the implication is none of these relationships can survive this absurd world in which these relationships are formed. They are formed by the world that is going to destroy them. And that, I think, ultimately is the message of this profoundly moving, but also, in its way, deeply gloomy film. That what unites us is more than what divides us. And what unites us isn't enough. I mentioned there the conversations that I recorded with Chris Clark about the circumstances in which Europe went to war in 1914 and the trance in which many of the leading protagonists found themselves. One of those two episodes is one of our bonus episodes. And this is just to remind you, if you'd like to hear that episode with Chris Clark and all of the bonus episodes that we have put out, and there are now many with Chris Clark, with Leah Ippey, with Shannon Valler, and others. All of them are available if you sign up to PPF Plus. If you sign up now, all of our bonus episodes will be available for you. Just go to ppfideas.com or click on the link in the show description. Next time in our series on the great political films, I'm going to be talking about an American film made just a couple of years after La Grande Illusion, but a very, very different kind of movie. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.